Hey everybody, and thanks for tuning in to the Ephrata Community Church weekly podcast. Conversation with our pastors and leaders meant to continue encouraging you to know God, know freedom, know purpose, and make a difference.
Hi, Ephrata Community Church, and any of those who feel like they're in some form of relationship with our community, we're thrilled to have you as part of us. My name's Jim Ehrman. I'm one of the teaching pastors here at Ephrata Community Church, and what a gift that is, right? Just to have that ability to be one of the voices. I love Psalm 42, and then it's referred to later again in the book of Revelations, where it says, many rivers make glad the city of God. And I love that image that there are different ways of understanding God. There's different ways of even holding the scriptures as a community, and to be entrusted to be one of those people that comes and gives you a kind of perspective. And then all of a sudden along comes someone like Benita or Matt Swords or, of course, Pastor Kevin, and we give you these different angles on what we think God's up to in the world. And there's no doubt that I have the privilege that there's a certain number of you in the community that kind of get it when I talk. And then there's others of you it's like, what did he just say? That was a confusing hot mess. But it's so exciting to get some of the feedback that we get. What a delight to pretty much before I'm even done a service, there's usually a Facebook message or a post somewhere, many of them directly to me on Facebook or even text sometimes, where someone's saying something they felt that they heard God say. So what I thought I would do today is I thought I'd read to you some of the summaries I got back from people since Sunday when I shared on what they experienced. Now, quickly, just in case you weren't here or didn't get a chance to fully be involved, we're in the midst of studying 7 spheres of society, right? Or 7 areas of influence. They're the 7 things we think you cross every single day of your life. You cannot wake up and decide you're not going to engage with law and government because you might stop at a stop sign, right? Or you may decide not to run into the street or something like that. By the way, I have no idea what running in the street has to do with dealing with law and government. All that to say is you engage with these 7 spheres every single day of your life, and one of them is arts and entertainment. And I was asked to speak on that, and just to remind you that, hey, you might even be an anti-culturalist and trying to block out arts and entertainment, but it finds its way into your world, into just even the way buildings are structured or built or towns are laid out. These are art forms that are quite practical, all the way up to the more elaborate and manifesting arts of like fine art, paintings, or cultural pieces that are commissioned. Arts is all around us. And I decided to speak a little bit on it and to say that, wow, the arts are a way that God brings revelation. And we oftentimes like to think like, well, that's true. Movies or music or pieces of art, that brings revelation when you have like time for it. Like the real things that bring revelation are like preaching, right? Or worshiping together. I'll have to remind you that even the art of preaching is exactly that. It's an art, or the way we've even built our auditorium to be able to welcome people. And we chatted a little bit about how much our world is infused with artistic design, whether that's interior design, whether that's culinary art, hospitality arts, fine arts, all the way down the line. Now that said, here's what I got back from some of you in response. So I'm going to read one particular email where someone took some time to summarize points. And these 4 things that this particular person feel they heard me say is pretty much of indicative of about 12, maybe 14 communications I had sent my way in the next few days. So here's one thing that was said to me, like, I was touched by how our creative process as artists begins as self-referencing at first, and that it's okay. And then how God then takes that self-reference and moves it out. Now, I want you to think about this. Of all of the 7 spheres, none begin as more self-referencing than in the area of art. And I mentioned in my sermon that offends some of us who don't actually live in a world of self-reflection as much. Artists tend to give out of something they're experiencing in themselves, right? So that's why art can oftentimes start looking self-referencing. Now, don't get me wrong. That doesn't mean you couldn't have a business person that's self-referencing. But in that sphere, if you're self-referencing, it looks more like self-absorption, which is a little different, where you're out to make money for yourself, right? If you're overly focused on self-reference there. Whereas in art, self-reference is actually a starting point that God designed, that art comes out of a place of solitude first. that involves self-reference. And so I think we have to get comfortable that a lot of times the art that we're seeing, I sometimes joke that my daughter, and some of you heard me allude to Genevieve during this sermon, my daughter is just classic. If you were to build a caricature of an artist, and if you were to follow her Instagram account at one level, you would think there might be self-reference or even self-absorption, the number of selfies. I mean, that's even a term we use for it, right? But I've learned something about that if I follow even her pictures that involve a lot of herself, there are so many sub-themes of what she believes in the larger world and what the change is that she's trying to be in the world. And so I do want to begin by at least speaking to this person who sent me this email and say this, we as the church, at one level, we want to permission some forms of self-reference for the artists in our midst and welcome them bringing out their traumas, their excitements, their celebrations into the public space. Now, there's a second thing that I spoke on, and I got a number of emails back, to admit that a lot of times when people first start their artistic enterprise, it's self-referencing, and for some artists, it actually is a form of dealing with pain or struggle in their own life, that they've adopted a form of art to actually cope or to express themselves in some way that they can't express in other ways. And I want to say that, we want to welcome this conversation around the struggles we faced. I mean, granted, we all know none of us want to slip into a victimhood or complete self-absorption, but it is okay to sit and say, hey, artists have a way of helping us think about our traumas sometimes that are going on in culture. And so that's one thing I heard back. I want to also say that another thing I've heard back was how artists are called to catalyze people that don't necessarily want to be catalyzed. I don't know if you're like me. I am a creature of habit. I mean, you may not think that. You might think that, Jim, you're kind of all over the place, etc. But let me tell you what, my day in and day out life, I go to same restaurants. I tend to order the same things. I tend to like a certain kind of movie. Now, that doesn't mean that I'm not willing to branch out occasionally, but at the end of the day, man, I walk, there's a quote I used by Rilke, and he said this, like, we walk the same path of carpet and we tend to hang out in the same corners of the rooms of our lives. And that's part of my life. And it's very hard, the older I get, to reawaken my imagination to anything other than that. Now, I'll tell you what does sometimes, movies, right? Movies sometimes bring me, or a book will all of a sudden pull me out and catalyze a different type of thinking. Or for me, sometimes a really well done message, like from someone who worked on not just presenting a truth, but figuring out why that truth is having so much difficulty finding good soil in me. And they actually kind of snuck up and tilled the soil in me a little bit so that the truth that they had could land. I consider that artistry to even do that. And I just want to remind those of you who are artists, one of the challenges of the calling on your life. Now, if you want to go become a self-absorbed artist, man, that's on you, man. Good for you. But if you're part of a missional community that we call the church, you have not been given your art just for self-understanding. You've been given your art to bring to the community and to reawaken our imagination, to catalyze us into new revelation. And I want to say thank you when you do that. But also I have to call you out, because one of the challenges of being an artist or a creative in a community is at the solitary place. Or let's put it this way, you find just a small group of people who get you, and you kind of hole up there, right? And I want to say this as someone who's in charge of helping to steward this community. We long for you to come out and bring us your art, even though we know it's stepping into a vulnerable place. So we appreciate the self-referencing where art starts in solitude, but we also have to call you out because we need you to help catalyze us into thinking. Now, you might sit and say, well, Jim, that just sounds like all big picture talk. Like, I just want to ask you, have you enjoyed some of our Easter productions? And I'm just using it as examples, like our Christmas productions over the last few years. They were full of artistry that took an age-old message of the death and resurrection of Jesus at Easter, or God incarnating himself and coming around us at Christmas. How many of us have heard these stories over and over, read Luke 2 how many times? But sometimes in the hands of artists, like we're even going to see this Christmas, when we get a dramatic retelling of the story of Christmas, that your imagination's reawakened. So we have this in our midst, and we want to continue to cultivate it. I mean, the last thing I want to share that someone pointed out is that art is often designed to first make us comfortable. We find a kind of art we like. But then secondly, it's designed to offend us or stretch us. Offend is a strong word. I used that word when I was speaking on the weekend, partly because I just wanted to reawaken us. And I ended up getting a lot of feedback about people like, oh my word, I never heard that about the Ark of the Covenant, that it was a common way to express art towards your God, was to have that thing that looked like the Ark of the Covenant. But yet, when it came to the Hebrew version of it, there was something very different. You weren't allowed to put a statue in the center of those angels or cherubim and seraphim. And I just want to remind you that art is there to both make us feel comfortable and meet us. Like, yeah, I love movies and I love a certain kind of music. But occasionally I need to allow some forms of art, or let's just using that example, some forms of movie to get into me, even though it's not my favorite way to receive truth or revelation or something like that. And so that is one of the challenges. Now, I share all this because of this. What's it mean for us as the church that don't necessarily view ourselves as creatives? I want to ask the question, what's it mean to make more space for creatives? Something happened this past weekend. Believe me, I've been hearing the messages. There was a healing that has begun, but for a healing to start, it usually involves like opening the wound and talking about it, right? So I want to say this. There are so many of you who have creative artistic instincts that reached out this week to thank our church for doing a message like this and being open to having these conversations, and particularly for what Kevin launched on Saturday night and I tried to continue on Sunday, where the church apologizes for its challenges in creating home for creatives, where creatives oftentimes feel, if you're here, out of step with the larger community. And sometimes many creatives aren't even in our midst because it doesn't even have enough of a sense of home to be there. We wanted to start by saying, hey, we get that and we want to do better. We want to do more towards you. But I turned to us as the community, and I even put it in this week's discussion guides for the Connect groups and said this: what can we do to initially create safer space for artists to tell us and creatives to tell us about their story? And then that way they can begin to bring their contribution to us and help build us as a people. So let me just end by saying it's been wonderful to be a part of this 7 areas of influence stuff. We think that arts and entertainment is a significant one in our world. We want to continue to grow as a church in this area, and we particularly want to speak a blessing again over those of you. And I hope some of you are back to practice in food in a way you haven't this week. I hope some of you break out watercolors that you haven't broken out. I hope some of you put pen to paper, or at least fingers to keyboards this week, whether it's a blog or even a haiku or a piece of poetry, whatever it is. We want to encourage you, take a first step and see how the Spirit meets you. We appreciate you. Have a good week.
Hey, thanks again for joining us today. We hope that you've been encouraged by listening and that you'll join us again next week. You can listen to previous episodes, find additional resources, and of course, learn more about us by visiting EphphatACommunityChurch.com.